When I was doing interviews for my college radio station many years ago, decades ago, one of the first interviews I did, I was really privileged and delighted to have the opportunity to meet Dr. Willie Ley, who during the 40s, 50s, and 60s wrote thought-provoking, imagination, mind-boggling articles about space and the future of space for Galaxy magazine and beyond. And I'm still very curious about space, and so when I see the Wall Street Journal, The Future of Everything, and their very recent special space travel edition, I decided to call upon our resident astronaut here in Manchester, Vermont. We're very privileged to have with us Gerald Carr, who is one of the pioneers of astronautics and the space program, right, Jerry?
So to speak, yes.
So, Jerry, again, pioneering, you were sort of to space what the covered wagons, driving out west in the United States. You were one of the pioneers of space. You want to tell our viewers a little bit about some of your accomplishments in your career?
Well, I entered the space program when the Gemini program was going on. Mercury had done its thing, and Gemini was near the end of its program when I was selected to be an astronaut. I came from a Marine Corps fighter pilot background and into the space program. I was very fortunate with my group of astronauts. There were 19 of us. Very fortunate to be able to be involved in the Apollo program. We didn't have much hope of flying in the Apollo program in my group, but at least we were very much involved in the mission control and the engineering and the training and everything that goes with the Apollo program. So that's basically where I was. The lunar landings, I worked as a capsule communicator on Apollo 8 and Apollo 12. And was assigned to Apollo 19, but unfortunately, because of the Vietnam War and budgetary considerations, NASA had to cancel 18, 19, and 20, and so I lost that opportunity to go to the moon, but was assigned instead to the Skylab program, which was to be America's first space station. And it turned out that we became the pathfinders for long-term spaceflight because one of the most important missions of our program was to learn more about what happens to the human body in space and how it reacts to being weightlessness and whether there are any permanent effects afterwards. And so that's where our mark was made, was on the Skylab program, which is part of the Apollo program, because Skylab used all Apollo equipment. So that's basically it. That's where I hit my pedigree. And then after I retired from NASA, I worked I formed a little company, and a couple of other astronauts and I worked with Boeing designing the International Space Station and configuring it for a long-term flight.
Well, Gerald Carr, you're very modest. I mean, you were a contemporary of space figures, astronauts like John Glenn and Alan Shepard and Neil Armstrong, right?
Yep.
You were...
Yeah, Neil Armstrong and I were dive buddies for our scuba training.
So, and Edwin Aldrin, I guess, who is still
Yeah.
with us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and at one point in time, you held the record for the duration in space, right?
That's correct. Yeah, it lasted for about 4.5 years, and then the Russians put up their mirror and began exceeding our record.
So maybe that's a good place for us to start. One of the recent articles connected to the future of everything in the Wall Street Journal, the space issue, was the article about how the body adapts to extended space travel. There's been a lot of study on that, and most recently with Scott Kelly and his brother, I guess, his twin brother. So give us the inside story on that from a personal perspective.
Well, I've always, since I flew, I've always tried to explain that physiological effect of weightlessness to people. And I usually start out saying, basically, the human body is very, very adaptable to whatever environment you put it in. And so a classic example would be Flatlander down here in this part of the country going to Denver, Colorado. And you get off the airplane, and you're not very good for climbing stairs for a day or a day and a half, 2 days. You don't have a whole lot of stamina because of the altitude and the lower pressure. But in a couple of days, you accommodate to it and you get along just fine. And that's an example that is pretty clearly an example of the adaptation of the human body. Now, in the space flight, we learned early on that the astronauts were returning from space missions. And the longer they stayed, the more inclined they were to feel like they were going to faint or have problems in terms of cardiovascular. And we determined that when you're in a weightless environment, your heart does not have to work as hard as it does down here on the Earth because it's not pumping blood up to your brain against gravity. So the heart begins to get lazy, is what I called it. It's basically atrophy. The muscles around the heart that pump it and keep it going don't have to work as hard. So what happens to muscles when you don't use them? They atrophy. Well, the big worry was before Skylab was that if an astronaut stayed in space too long, he or she might return back down to the Earth, and the heart may not be able to pick up the slack immediately, and you'd have a heart failure. And so that began to worry them a little bit. And so one of the main missions of Skylab was to study this cardiovascular deconditioning and try to see what could be done about it. What they did is they decided to use the simplest solution with atrophied muscles. The solution is exercise. So exercise became the thing.
To compensate.
To compensate for, to keep the cardiovascular system nice and firm and active. So the first crew on Skylab went up for 28 days. They spent half an hour every day in heavy exercise. And they came back down from their missions, and they weren't in good shape. The doctors were unhappy. The crew was unhappy. So the second crew, headed by Alan Bean, stayed up for 59 days, exercised every single day for 1 full hour every day. When they got back down from their mission, they were much better off than the first crew, but the doctors still weren't happy because they weren't close enough to what we call baseline. That's what you were when you left. So my crew with an 84-day mission was given an hour and a half every single day to exercise, and we did it religiously. And when we got back down, the doctors looked us over and they said, you may be in better shape now than when you left. So we essentially solved the problem. We've figured exercise is really the thing to do to keep yourself in good shape.
I remember as a youngster hearing about the space program and looking at it at first glance that someone went up in Gemini, a shot or went around the Earth. Many people would question, well, what is the relevance?
Yeah.
What is the meaning? But there were many, many products and improvements that came out of the space program.
Yeah,
right?
The problem is we didn't know they were coming, that the space program would do those sorts of things. I think the main impetus in the early spacecraft was strictly exploration.
I mean, even things like videotape machines and a lot of the miniaturization of certain products that you have today
Right.
were developed, right, during...
As a necessity because of you can't take a lot of weight into space. But nowadays, getting back to the physiological thing, we have Mark and Scott and Kelly, and when Scott flew, Mark was on the ground, and they did simultaneous experiments on the two. And they did note that Scott did a lot of changing. His DNA modified somewhat, had a lot of changes. But the interesting thing is when he got back down again, it took a long time, but he's finally back to baseline.
But when you're up in space for an extended period of time, Jerry Carr, do you feel good? I mean, or do you have good days and bad days like you might have on planet Earth here, where some days you feel great and other days not so great? What is
Well, I think it was a little bit more level playing field, I would say. I don't remember having a lot of bad days, a lot of good days. The one thing that you really notice when you become weightless for at the beginning is that all of your body fluids want to shift back up higher in your body because your gravity is not pulling them down. And so the body fluids tend to accumulate, and you get this feeling of congestion. The veins in your forehead stand out a little bit, and your eyes feel like they're bugged out a little bit. And that's kind of uncomfortable for a while until you begin to get it back under control again. And it's the exercise that really made you feel good. You'd get on that bike and start pedaling, and all that blood would start coming down because the muscles in the legs needed it.
Now, a lot of the Wall Street Journal, the space issue that they recently published, is devoted to or hovers around extended periods in space and, for example, welcome to your home on Mars. And I think very few people can comprehend what the reality of an undertaking like that or a project like that really consists of. Someone like you probably has a much better sense and understanding, a much better depth of what's involved here, right? To say, go to Mars.
Yeah, you have to bring your environment with you because the Mars environment's not compatible with the human. And so you got to bring your own environment, and that means you've got to, if you're going to stay there for a while, you have to build a habitat that could be pressurized, and the environment, the gases could be added to that we can manage. When you want to go outside, your suit has to provide that. And so there's been lots of very, very unique ideas put forth on how to build a habitat. The Bigelow Company has been designing inflatable habitats for some time now. And they're going to be testing one, if they're not already up there, they're testing one on the International Space Station very soon. You have a lunar rover, or a Mars rover of some kind that you can easily get into and get out of. The rover is just like getting into your car, except you don't want to let any air in while you're making the transfer. And we talked a lot about a suit that could be attached to the rover as well, so that if you were out in a rover and you found something and you wanted to get out and look at it, you could get into the suit that was attached to the rover, again, a little airlock between them, and then you could get into the suit and go over and evaluate whatever it is you want to look at, and then come back, reattach to the rover, get in the rover, and so you have to bring your environment with you. You can't do much else.
And I guess, Jerry, the idea was that the Mars environment was much more habitable or comparable to Earth versus doing this, setting up a colony on the moon, right?
I'm not sure that's the prime impetus, but...
Was there ever any debate or the idea of colonizing the moon or setting up something there?
Yeah.
But the United States seemed to have abandon after a period of time. With all of these very successful moonshots, they seem to have abandoned the
that's the program. Been there, done that kind of attitude.
And was that a good idea in your estimation?
No, I don't think so at all. The habitation on the moon, I think, would have been a very good idea, and I think it's still a reasonably likely thing to happen, because we could do a lot of rehearsal for Mars exploration, just staging it and testing out equipment in a harsh environment.
So that would have been a dry run, so to speak,
yes,
for Mars. But the belief, I believe that they're going right to Mars, right?
Well, I'm not sure that they've really firmed that one up, because there's still a very strong impetus to go back to the moon and rehearse before you go on to Mars.
And on a project like that, wouldn't there be boredom? What do you do all day? How do you spend your time? Wouldn't there be a lot of monotony?
I would suspect there would be, but there'll be lots of experiments to do, lots of exercise to do to keep the body in good shape.
But wouldn't the novelty of that wear off at some point? How would you say keep your mind stimulated with reading or music or
That's what you have to do.
So
it'd be music and reading, and nothing to see out the window, because you'll be out, getting away from the Earth and toward Mars, and there's nothing much out there to look at. But lots of experiments, medical experiments, and deep space experiments, scans of various areas that you can scan. So I think there'll be plenty to do. It's not that you'll just be sitting there writing and trying to stay awake.
Now, Werner von Braun, who I believe you knew,
yes,
who was one of the triggers of the space program, he predicted that by now we would have been going to Mars, right? He predicted that we would have been colonizing the moon. We would have been well ahead of where we are now in space.
Yeah, and that's just our short-term memory, I would say, or short attention span that the U.S. has. You couldn't keep up the funding. There were other things of interest to do, and so it just hasn't happened. It's because of lack of will and consistency and determination to keep the program going full blast.
When I was a student, you had I think it was the 8 or 9 planets in the universe, the solar system. And now, we have so many planets that we've discovered, right?
Yeah, as a result of putting telescopes up into space outside the Earth's atmosphere.
And what do you feel is the significance of that, the profound meaning of that?
I think Carl Sagan expressed it better than anyone I've ever heard. He did a presentation called the Small Blue Dot, and you can find it on the internet, on probably in YouTube. But he talks about the fact that having gotten out into space and looked out further, we realize how insignificant we are. That we're just a tiny dot, and Carl and his crew, his people who worked with him on the Voyager program. The Voyager was the mission that was to go through the solar system and out into deep space beyond our solar system. And he convinced NASA that what they should do when they got to what they consider to be the farthest point out of the solar system, to turn the spacecraft around and take pictures of the Earth. And in this thing, he very graphically points out the fact that when you go back and look at the Earth from out there, you can't hardly see it. It's just tiny little blue dot.
So, with Mars, is it conceivable that in the next 25 years that we would have a regular program going to Mars where people would go back and forth.
We could do it just like we're
Mars.
doing the regular program on the International Space Station now, and that station now is always inhabited. It's never empty, and we never would have expected to do that for.
One of the issues that the Wall Street Journal raised was the number of other nations that are now getting into a space program. Israel has a moonshot, I think, that they did. Of course, Russia, China, North Korea, they're talking about doing something. India and Pakistan are doing something. What is the impact of this with all of these other nations getting into space?
Well, there's the impact is competition. People want to stake out a claim, and in the family of people who are space explorers, and that's sort of a thing having to do with your own self-value. My particular feeling about all the different countries going out in there is after they've cut their teeth and done something, we really ought to mount an international effort to go to Mars or to do some of these other things that are big time, because it's big money, and it's hard on the economy of any given country to do that. So if we could figure out a way to cooperatively evaluate and explore space, I think it would be much better. The moon, we've got a space treaty, a lunar treaty that says no one can claim property on the moon and that sort of thing. But I think when some of these countries get there, they'll start staking out claims whether there's a moon treaty or not.
Well, conceivably, there could be a war in space, right?
Certainly,
that takes place in space. And President Trump recently initiated a Space Force, which I guess NASA has pretty much run the space program together with the Air Force, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Air Force run the military side, and the NASA runs the research and development exploration side of it, and that was kind of what their original plan was. NASA was not expected to get into the operations business, and by operations I mean setting up settlements and running a settlement and doing that sort of thing. I think the original framers were thinking that what we want to do is let NASA do the heavy lifting and learn what we need to do, and then turn it over to commercialization, very much like the aviation industry. The government flew the airplanes in the beginnings, and not many private people were into it. And when it got into delivering the mail and doing some of the things that they did, the NASA backed out, and all they do in aviation is they study aerodynamics and hypersonics and that sort of thing. And the commercial development of aviation has been the entrepreneurs. And NASA has in my view, has had in mind the idea of that same sort of a pattern for the space program. And that's what's going on now with all these companies that are starting up and getting into various phases of commercialization of space.
But satellites are so important to our way of life and economic development, and I guess there's hundreds of satellites, right, in space that the United States has. And conceivably, if there was a war in space, an alien nation would want to disengage or destroy these satellites. They could destroy a lot of the economy, right? And,
That's right.
Strategic advantage of the United States here, right?
Yeah, communications is the most important thing, and I think one of the first things an enemy will want to do in space is knock out all your communications, because the communications is what connects many of the systems down here on Earth.
So it's conceivable a war could take place mainly in space, destroying these satellites, right?
Sure, yeah.
So,
You could, completely destroy a country's ability to distribute its electricity and that sort of thing.
so what about entrepreneurship, private enterprise? You mentioned early on what you did with your company, but of course, Jeff Bezos, he's talking about having a flight. He has that Blue Origin space flight company.
Yeah.
Do you see a big marketplace for that where all of us are going to be going up, like taking the New York City subway or something?
I don't know that I see space tourism as being a big thing, because the only people who could afford to do something like that are the wealthy people, and there are not many people in the middle class or in that area that would be able to do something like that. So it seems to me that space tourism thing is going to be just for the elite and the wealthy people, and the rest of the people down here on Earth will just, their benefit from the space programs and the satellites and everything will be the communications, the internets, the satellite phones, the controlling of the grid so that your electricity is more reliable and more evenly distributed.
Another article in the journal was the belief that Antarctica is able to teach us a lot about extraterrestrial life, right?
Yeah, there are some people that have been studying bacterial growth and bacteria, and they feel that there are bacteria in the Antarctic area in a very, very harsh environment that managed to get along okay. They have become tougher and learned how to live in a harsh environment. And I seem to have read somewhere where bacteria from that are very happy in a very hot, very acidic kinds of environment, which is Mars, they get along just as well. That bacteria lives just as well and adapts to the Antarctic in that cold, harsh environment. So that these people are saying, yeah, you have living things that are existing in both environments.
Jerry Carr, I want to close our show in the remaining minute about your fondness of Manchester, Vermont, where you've made your home for a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Well,
despite all of this worldly universe that your mind is teeming with. Right?
Well, we've lived here for 13 years now. We came here from the Ozarks of Arkansas, where we lived for about 20 years. My wife Pat and I are both very concerned about the environment. One of the things that troubled me the most when I looked down from Skylab down at the Earth was the pollution that I could see. And I could see the damage that human beings are doing to the environment of the Earth. And so that's been one of the areas that we're most concerned with. One of the reasons why we moved up into the Ozarks and lived out in the woods for 20 years. We had a six-mile dirt road drive to get to the first paved highway. And so moving to Vermont was a natural thing for us because of the environment and the Vermont attitude toward the environment. But of course, we had family issues that wanted us. We had family up here that wanted us to come closer to them. So, two reasons to come to Vermont. But we are very happy here. We're in an area where people appreciate the environment and agree with us about the need to be good stewards of the place where we live.
We've been talking with Jerry Carr this past half hour about the future of everything as it relates to space. And again, Jerry Carr is one of the pioneers of the world space program, the U.S. space program. And he is one of the pioneer astronauts, and real privilege to have you with us again.
Thank you, Danny.
This is Danny Frank for GNAT-TV.